The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Widmore estate as Eleanor stood in the corner of the drawing room watching her younger sister Natasha adjust her pink gown for the third time. Their father paced near the fireplace checking his pocket watch every few moments waiting for the Duke of Ashford to arrive. Eleanor had always known her place in the family. At 32 she was the practical daughter. The one who managed the household accounts when her father forgot. The one who sat with their aging mother during her final months reading poetry aloud until dawn. The one whose worth was measured in usefulness rather than beauty. Natasha at 26 was different. Golden hair that caught the light just so. A smile that made people pause mid-sentence. The daughter their father placed his hopes upon when the debts grew too heavy and the estate began to crumble at its edges. "Remember what I told you," their father said to Natasha though his eyes barely left the window. "Smile but not too much. Speak when spoken to. And for heaven's sake stand up straight." Eleanor adjusted the collar of her blue dress and tried to make herself smaller. She had not wanted to be here for this. Had suggested she might visit the tenants in the East Cottages instead. But her father insisted both daughters should be present when the Duke arrived. "It shows we're a proper family," he had said the night before over a quiet dinner. Even if, he had not finished the sentence but Eleanor knew what he meant. Even if only one daughter was worth presenting. The sound of horses on gravel brought everyone to attention. Eleanor watched her father smooth his jacket and plaster on a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Natasha took a deep breath and Eleanor found herself moving closer to her sister without thinking. "You look beautiful," Eleanor whispered. Natasha squeezed her hand quickly before their father could see. "I'm frightened," she whispered back. "I know." The Duke of Ashford entered the room with less ceremony than Eleanor expected. He was perhaps 40 with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He greeted their father with polite formality then turned to face the two sisters. Eleanor saw her father's hand move almost imperceptibly toward Natasha. The gesture was clear even in its subtlety. "Here, this one. Take the pretty one." But the Duke's gaze had already moved past Natasha and settled on Eleanor. She felt her cheeks warm under his attention and looked down at her hands. "Would you ladies care to join me for a walk in the gardens?" the Duke asked. His voice was quieter than Eleanor expected. Gentler. Their father started to speak but the Duke had already moved toward Eleanor offering his arm. She took it because she did not know what else to do and they walked out into the morning air with Natasha following a step behind and their father watching from the doorway with confusion creasing his forehead. The gardens had been their mother's pride once. Now they were overgrown in places but still beautiful in the way wild things often are. The Duke walked slowly as if he had nowhere else to be. "Your father tells me you manage much of the estate affairs," he said to Eleanor. She glanced at him in surprise. "I help where I can. It's nothing of importance." "I disagree," he said. "My own estate has been without proper management since my wife passed 3 years ago. I have come to learn that the running of a household is perhaps the most important work of all." They walked in silence for a moment. Behind them Eleanor could hear Natasha's light footsteps and the rustle of her pink gown against the gravel path. "May I speak plainly?" the Duke asked. Eleanor nodded though her heart had begun to beat faster. "I know why your father invited me here today. I know his circumstances and I know what he hopes will come of this visit." The Duke paused near a bench beneath an old oak tree. "But I am too old for games and too tired for pretense. I am not looking for beauty or youth or any of the things men are supposed to seek. I am looking for kindness. For steadiness. For someone who knows that life is long and often difficult and that what matters most is having a companion who will face it with grace." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes and blinked them back quickly. No one had ever spoken to her this way. As if what she had to offer might be exactly enough. "I don't know you well yet," the Duke continued. "But I see something in you that I recognize. A quietness that comes from carrying others. A strength that doesn't need to announce itself." He turned to look at her fully then. "Would you consider allowing me to call on you properly? Not because your father wishes it but because I wish it." Eleanor could not speak for a moment. She looked back toward the house where her father stood in the window watching them. Then she looked at Natasha who had stopped a respectful distance away and was pretending to examine a rosebush. "I am not what anyone expects," Eleanor finally said. "I am not accomplished or charming. I read too much and I worry about things that don't concern me, and I have a terrible habit of correcting people when they quote poetry incorrectly." The Duke smiled then. A real smile that changed his entire face. "Those sound like excellent qualities to me." They walked for another hour talking about books and about the management of estates and about the small ordinary things that make up a life. The Duke asked her opinion on matters of crop rotation and tenant welfare and listened to her answers as if they mattered. When they returned to the house, Eleanor's father pulled the Duke aside with barely concealed urgency. "Perhaps we might speak privately," her father said in a low voice. "About arrangements. About Natasha." The Duke shook his head politely but firmly. "I have made my choice, sir. With your permission I would like to court Eleanor." The color drained from her father's face. "Eleanor. But surely you can see that Natasha is, that is to say." "Eleanor is a fine girl, of course, but Eleanor is precisely who I am interested in," the Duke said. There was steel beneath the gentleness now. "If that is not acceptable to you, then I will take my leave." Eleanor watched her father struggle with himself. She knew what he was thinking. The debts, the crumbling estate, the limited options remaining to them. Finally he nodded stiffly. Over the following months the Duke called regularly. He brought Eleanor books from his library and asked her advice on matters concerning his own estate. He met with her father's steward and quietly arranged for certain debts to be forgiven and certain repairs to be made to the Whitmore property. He never made a show of his generosity and never asked for gratitude. Natasha married a kind young lawyer the following spring. Someone she had met at church and fallen in love with properly. At the wedding she pulled Eleanor aside. "I was so relieved when he chose you," Natasha whispered. "I know that sounds terrible, but I was terrified of being married off to someone I didn't know. Someone who only wanted me for my face." She hugged her sister tightly. "You deserve this, Eleanor. You deserve to be chosen." Eleanor married the Duke on a quiet autumn morning with falling leaves like gold coins scattered across the church steps. Her father gave her away with tears in his eyes and an apology he could not quite voice. She forgave him anyway because she had learned that carrying bitterness was exhausting and life was too short for grudges. The Duke took her hand as they stood at the altar and she felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was not a fairy tale. It was something better. It was two people choosing each other with clear eyes and open hearts. Choosing partnership over perfection. Choosing substance over shine. In the years that followed, Eleanor transformed the Duke's estate into something remarkable. She knew every tenant by name and every field by its particular challenges. She hosted gatherings that people remembered not for their grandeur but for their warmth. And she loved her husband with the steady, enduring love of someone who had never expected to be chosen and therefore knew the precious weight of that choice. Sometimes in the evening they would sit together in the library and she would read aloud while he listened. And he would look at her in the lamplight and think about how close he had come to missing this. To following expectation instead of instinct. To choosing beauty when what he needed was grace. "I was so afraid that day," Eleanor said once as they sat together. "When you chose me instead of Natasha. I thought you were making a mistake." The Duke took her hand and kissed her fingers gently. "My dear," he said. "It was the first truly right decision I had made in years." And Eleanor, who had spent so much of her life being overlooked, finally understood that being seen by the right person was worth more than being admired by everyone. That true love was not about being perfect but about being perfectly matched. And that sometimes the greatest gift was not being chosen first but being chosen well.